In a lavish hotel lobby, Lucas Donovan, a strikingly tall figure dressed in a tailored navy suit, made his way toward the exit. His presence commanded attention. There was an air of authority and sophistication about him that matched the opulence of the surroundings. It wasn't unusual for people to stop and glance twice. After all, he was the owner of this empire, a self-made billionaire whose face often graced the covers of business magazines. But today, something unusual happened. Wait, a desperate voice broke through the hum of the lobby. It was Sarah, a young housekeeper wearing the hotel's signature uniform. Her face was flushed, and her eyes were wide with urgency. She rushed toward Lucas, her shoes making quick, sharp sounds against the marble floor. Several guests turned their heads, taken aback by the unexpected scene. Lucas paused, his brow furrowing in annoyance. It wasn't common for an employee to address him directly, let alone in such a frantic manner. "Sir, please," Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly as she reached him. "I need to talk to you now. It's important." He looked down at her, a mixture of irritation and curiosity flashing across his sharp blue eyes. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" His tone was cold, but there was a hint of intrigue hidden beneath the surface. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Donovan, and that's why I'm asking you not to go." Lucas felt a surge of irritation. He was already late for his flight to meet his mother in New York, a trip that had been planned for weeks. "You're wasting my time," he said flatly, adjusting the cufflinks on his sleeve. "What could possibly be so urgent?" Sarah's eyes softened, her desperation turning into a silent plea. "Please don't go with your mother," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "If you go, it will ruin everything. For you, for me, for us." Her words hung in the air, an eerie tension filling the space between them. For the first time, Lucas noticed the emotion in her eyes, a mix of fear, regret, and something else he couldn't place. "Us?" he repeated slowly, his expression turning from annoyance to confusion. "I don't even know who you are." Tears finally spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she struggled to maintain her composure. "I know it sounds crazy," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but you need to trust me. Just this once." Lucas studied her, his mind racing. He was a man driven by logic, someone who dealt with numbers and contracts, not sudden pleas from hotel staff. Yet there was something raw and real in Sarah's desperation that he couldn't ignore. Before he could respond, his assistant approached, her voice calm but urgent. "Mr. Donovan, the car is ready. We need to leave now, or we'll miss the flight." Lucas glanced at his assistant, then back at Sarah. He hesitated, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he had seen this woman before. But where? When? Sarah's lips trembled. "Please," she begged one last time. "If you have any compassion, if you ever cared about the truth, don't get on that plane." Lucas remained silent, his gaze piercing but uncertain. He felt a battle raging inside him, a conflict between the logical businessman he had become and the instinctual pull of something deeper, something from a past he had long buried. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, with a cold resolve, he spoke. "If you think this is the way to manipulate me, you're mistaken," he said, turning away. "I don't have time for these games." He stepped forward, his footsteps echoing through the lobby as Sarah stood frozen, watching helplessly as he walked away. But just before reaching the door, he paused again, as if reconsidering. He turned his head slightly, catching a final glimpse of her, tears streaking her face, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He felt a strange tug at his heart, one he hadn't felt in years. Yet he continued walking. As he stepped into the waiting car, a nagging feeling of unease settled over him, like a storm brewing on the horizon. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a final, ominous decision. Inside the car, Lucas remained silent, his mind replaying Sarah's words over and over. "If you go, it will ruin everything, for us." And for reasons he couldn't explain, a single thought kept repeating in his mind as the car sped toward the airport. Who is she? The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet suburb when a sleek, black luxury car slowly pulled up in front of a modest two-story house. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but the powerful hum of the engine was enough to draw curious glances from a few early risers in the neighborhood. The house itself was nothing special. Peeling paint on the shutters, a small garden filled with overgrown plants, and a faded porch swing that creaked with the morning breeze. Inside, Sarah was barely awake. She was in the kitchen, dressed in a simple robe, heating water for tea. Her eyes were red and puffy from the sleepless night that followed her encounter with Lucas Donovan. She couldn't shake the memory of his cold, dismissive gaze, or the way he had walked away without a second thought. Her plea had fallen on deaf ears, and now the weight of her failure pressed heavily on her chest. A sudden knock at the door startled her, causing the teapot to clatter against the counter. She hadn't been expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. Her heart raced as she approached the front door, hesitating before opening it. Standing there, to her shock, was Lucas Donovan. His appearance was unexpected, almost surreal. He was dressed casually, a stark contrast to his usual tailored suits. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he had run his hands through it multiple times in frustration. The moment their eyes met, Sarah felt a mix of fear and defiance bubbling inside her. She knew this wasn't just a casual visit. There was an intent behind those piercing blue eyes. "Mind if I come in?" Lucas's voice was calm but carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Sarah's grip on the doorknob tightened. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze briefly sweeping over the small living room visible from the door. "I had some time before my next flight," he finally said, his tone measured. "And you left me with questions that can't wait." For a moment, Sarah considered slamming the door shut, but she knew better than to let fear guide her actions. With a resigned sigh, she stepped aside and let him in. Lucas entered, his presence immediately filling the cramped space. His eyes wandered, taking in the worn furniture, the framed photos on the walls, and the faint scent of freshly brewed tea. It was a far cry from the opulence he was used to, but there was an undeniable warmth to it, something he hadn't felt in years. Sarah gestured toward the small, cluttered table. "Sit down," she said quietly, her voice still tinged with the weariness of the previous night. He did as she asked, though his posture remained rigid, as if he were still in one of his boardrooms. "You owe me an explanation," he stated plainly, his gaze fixed on her. She met his eyes, her expression hardening. "I already gave you one," she replied. "You just didn't listen." Lucas leaned forward, his frustration evident. "You barged into my life out of nowhere, begging me not to board a flight. You expect me to ignore everything I've built for a vague, emotional plea?" Sarah's eyes flared with anger. "This isn't about your empire, Lucas. This is about something much more personal. But you were too busy thinking about your schedule to care." He exhaled sharply, trying to rein in his temper. "Then help me understand," he said, his voice softer this time. "Who are you? Really? Why did you come to me?" For a long moment, Sarah remained silent, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were trembling slightly. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked quietly. "Remember what?" "Us," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. 10 years ago, before you were Lucas Donovan, the billionaire. Before everything changed." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced back, trying to piece together memories that felt like distant fragments of another life. A flash of an old apartment, late nights filled with laughter, and a young woman who had meant everything to him before he abruptly walked away in pursuit of his ambitions. But could this be her? The same woman he had left behind so many years ago? "You're Sarah," he finally said, the realization dawning on him. "Sarah Peterson." "Yes," she confirmed, tears now freely streaming down her face. "And I wasn't just a part of your past, Lucas. I was your life. Until you left." Lucas's chest tightened. He felt a strange combination of guilt and disbelief. He had spent the last decade trying to forget that chapter of his life, burying it beneath success and wealth. But now, sitting here in her humble home, the past felt unbearably close, like a wound that had never truly healed. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why wait until now?" Sarah hesitated. her eyes filled with a pain she could no longer hide. "Because I wanted to protect you from something that could destroy you," she said, her voice cracking. "Something that I never thought I'd have to tell you." Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, the suspense becoming almost unbearable. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What could possibly be so terrible that you kept it hidden for a decade?" She looked up, her eyes full of a desperation he hadn't seen before. "It's not about me," she said slowly. "It's about him." "Him?" Lucas's confusion deepened. "Who are you talking about?" "Our son," Sarah answered, her voice breaking completely. "The son you never knew existed." The words hit Lucas like a tidal wave, leaving him stunned and speechless. He stared at Sarah, trying to process the enormity of what she had just revealed. His mind struggled to accept the reality of it. A child, his child, growing up without him, never knowing his father's face. "You're lying," he whispered. But the look in Sarah's eyes told him it was the truth. "I wish I were," she replied, tears falling silently. "But he's real, Lucas. And he needs you now more than ever." For the first time in years, Lucas felt truly lost. The world he had built, the empire he controlled with precision and power, suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of this devastating revelation. He rose abruptly, pacing the small living room. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded again, his voice hoarse. "Why did you keep him from me?" Sarah's shoulders slumped as if the weight of her decision had finally broken her. "Because I was scared," she confessed. "Scared that you wouldn't care. Scared of what you had become. Scared that I would lose him the same way I lost you." Lucas stopped, his back turned to her as he struggled to regain his composure. "I need to see him," he said finally, his voice firm. "I need to know him." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of his request. "You can," she said softly, "but it won't be easy. He's not ready to meet a father who abandoned him before he was born." Lucas turned to face her, his eyes filled with a determination that hadn't been there before. "I'll do whatever it takes," he vowed. "I won't walk away this time." And as the morning sun crept through the window, a new, uncertain chapter began for both of them. One that was bound by the unspoken promise of redemption and the painful reality of lost years. It was early afternoon when Lucas's private investigator handed him a manila envelope, its contents thick with the past he had tried to forget. Sitting in his penthouse office, overlooking the city he had conquered, Lucas felt a deep sense of unease as he opened it. Inside were photographs, old addresses, and documents, evidence of Sarah's life over the past decade. And there, among the papers, was a single photo that caught his breath. The boy in the picture was around 12 years old, with sandy brown hair and a striking resemblance to a younger Lucas. He was sitting on the front steps of the very house Lucas had visited that morning. His posture was guarded, his expression distant, as if he carried burdens far too heavy for someone his age. Lucas traced the outline of the photo with his thumb, his heart heavy with regret and disbelief. His son. A son he had never known existed until today. The weight of missed birthdays, untold stories, and lost years pressed down on him. He felt a painful mix of anger and sadness. Anger at Sarah for hiding the truth, but also at himself for not being there when it mattered most. "His name is Matthew," the investigator said, breaking the silence. "He's a good kid, from what I've gathered. Quiet, keeps to himself mostly, gets good grades, but there have been some issues at school recently." Lucas's attention snapped back to the investigator. "Issues? What kind of issues?" The man hesitated. "He's been in a few fights, sir. Nothing too serious, but the teachers are concerned. It seems like he's having trouble adjusting." Lucas's jaw tightened. His son was struggling, and he had no idea. The guilt gnawed at him, deeper than he expected. "Does he know about me?" he asked quietly. The investigator shook his head. "Not as far as I can tell. Sarah has been very protective. It's clear she's kept him away from anything related to you." Lucas leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He felt trapped between the life he had built and the one he had abandoned, unsure of how to bridge the gap. But he knew one thing for certain. He had to meet Matthew. Not as a businessman or a stranger, but as a father. Later that afternoon, Lucas found himself standing at the edge of a small soccer field in a local park. His designer suit and polished shoes looked out of place among the worn benches and kids in tattered jerseys. He watched as a group of boys ran after a ball, laughing and shouting. It took him a moment to spot Matthew, standing off to the side, watching the game without joining in. Lucas's heart ached at the sight. He noticed the way Matthew's shoulders were slightly slumped, his eyes following the ball with a yearning that suggested he wanted to play but didn't quite know how to join in. It was the same hesitation Lucas had seen in the photo, the same loneliness he felt creeping into his own life now. Summoning his courage, Lucas approached slowly, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. As he got closer, Matthew sensed someone approaching and turned around. The boy's eyes, so familiar and yet so distant, met Lucas's. "Hey," Lucas said, his voice softer than he intended. "Are you Matthew?" Matthew eyed him warily, his expression guarded. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. Lucas felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure how to answer that question. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many explanations that wouldn't make sense to a child. But he couldn't start with the truth. Not yet. "I'm a friend of your mom's," he said carefully. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Mom doesn't have many friends," he said bluntly. Lucas couldn't help but admire the boy's directness. "I know," he admitted, "but I'd like to get to know you, if that's okay." Matthew's suspicion didn't ease. "Why?" he asked simply. Lucas wasn't prepared for such a straightforward question. He had expected resistance, anger, maybe even tears, but not this quiet curiosity mixed with skepticism. "Because I think you deserve to have more people who care about you," he replied honestly. "And because I've missed a lot of things I wish I hadn't." The boy seemed to consider this for a moment, then shrugged. "Okay," he said, but it wasn't an acceptance. It was more of an indifferent acknowledgement, as if he had heard similar promises before and learned not to believe them too quickly. They stood in silence for a while, both unsure of what to say next. Lucas felt the awkwardness grow, but he also felt something else, hope. He had taken the first step, even if it was shaky and uncertain. "You like soccer?" Lucas finally asked, pointing to the ball rolling across the field. Matthew nodded slowly. "Yeah, I used to play a lot, but I stopped." "Why did you stop?" Lucas asked, genuinely curious. The boy looked away, his expression hardening. Things got complicated. Lucas understood that response more than he wanted to admit. "Well," he said, trying to lighten the mood, "maybe we can kick the ball around sometime. I wasn't half bad back in the day." Matthew looked back at him, a faint hint of a smile on his lips. It was a small victory, but one that gave Lucas the strength to keep trying. "Maybe," the boy said, his tone still guarded but less hostile. Lucas was about to say more when a familiar voice called out from behind them. "Matthew, time to go." Sarah stood by the edge of the field, her face a mixture of relief and worry. Lucas knew she had been watching, probably from a distance, to make sure things didn't go wrong. As Matthew ran toward her, she locked eyes with Lucas. "He's not ready," she said quietly when Lucas reached her. "This is all too sudden." Lucas nodded, his voice low. "I know, but I had to start somewhere." Sarah sighed, her gaze softening for a brief moment. "Give him time, Lucas. He's been hurt before, and he doesn't trust easily." "I won't push him," Lucas promised, "but I won't disappear either." Sarah seemed to accept this, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. "We'll see," she said, her tone both a warning and a hope. As she turned to leave, Matthew paused, looking back at Lucas one last time. "See you around," he said, his voice casual but holding a hint of something more. A cautious willingness to open the door just a little bit. "See you," Lucas replied, feeling a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in years. And as they walked away, Lucas stood alone by the field, watching the sun set slowly behind the trees, knowing that this was only the beginning of a long, uncertain journey. A journey toward redemption, connection, and a chance to finally reclaim what he had lost so many years ago. It was a stormy evening when Lucas found himself sitting alone in his penthouse, the lights of the city below blurred by sheets of rain. He cradled a whiskey glass, its amber contents barely touched. His mind was far from the world of business deals and luxury. It was stuck on the events of the past few days. The image of Matthew's wary eyes lingered, a silent reminder of the years Lucas had missed and the trust that now seemed impossibly distant. His son's guarded expression had spoken volumes, filled with questions Lucas wasn't ready to answer. A soft chime broke his thoughts, his phone, buzzing on the glass coffee table. He picked it up, seeing Sarah's name flash across the screen. Surprised, he hesitated before answering. "Lucas." Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady despite the swirl of emotions. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice strained. "It's about Matthew. It's urgent." Lucas's grip tightened around the phone. "What happened? Is he okay?" There was a pause before she answered, her voice heavy with worry. "He's having a rough time. He got into another fight at school today. This time it was worse." Lucas's heart sank. He knew the struggles of trying to fit into a world that didn't quite accept you, but hearing that Matthew was experiencing the same pain felt like a dagger to his chest. "Is he hurt?" he asked, his voice urgent. "No, he's not physically hurt," Sarah replied. "But he's angry, Lucas. He's confused, and I don't know how to reach him anymore." "I want to help," Lucas said firmly. "Whatever it takes." There was a long silence on the other end, filled only by the sound of Sarah's uneven breathing. "Meet me at the diner on 5th Street, she finally said. "We need to talk about this face to face." Lucas didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. The rain hadn't let up when Lucas stepped into the diner, shaking water from his coat. The place was small and old-fashioned, with red vinyl booths and neon signs that flickered intermittently. It was almost empty, save for a few regulars sipping coffee. He spotted Sarah sitting at a corner booth, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as he approached, her eyes tired but resolute. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly, gesturing for him to sit. Lucas slid into the booth, his gaze never leaving her face. "Tell me everything," he urged. "I want to understand." Sarah rubbed her temples, her exhaustion evident. "Matthew got into a fight with a kid who made fun of him for not having a dad," she explained, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the diner's jukebox. "He's heard things from the other kids, things about you, about who you are." Lucas felt a surge of anger, not at Matthew, but at himself and the circumstances that had led to this moment. "So he knows about me," he said slowly. "Yes," Sarah confirmed, her eyes reflecting a mixture of frustration and sadness. "But not everything. He just knows you're someone powerful and rich, someone who wasn't there." Lucas clenched his jaw, the guilt overwhelming. "I need to talk to him. He deserves to know the truth, even if it's painful." Sarah's eyes flashed with uncertainty. "Lucas, you can't just show up and expect everything to be fine. He's been hurt too many times, and I can't let you hurt him again." "I'm not here to hurt him, Sarah," Lucas insisted. "I just want to be a part of his life." She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words against the past. "It's not just about showing up, Lucas," she said finally, her voice breaking. "It's about staying." "He's never had that before." Lucas nodded slowly. "I know," he said, his voice filled with raw emotion. "And I want to prove to both of you that I'm not the same man who walked away 10 years ago." Sarah studied him, searching for sincerity. "He's at home right now," she said. "He's refusing to talk to me. Maybe he'll talk to you." Lucas's eyes widened in surprise. "You're letting me see him?" "I'm letting you try," she corrected, her voice firm but not unkind. "But if he pushes back, you need to respect that." "I will," Lucas promised. "I just want to try." They left the diner together, the rain still falling hard as they drove to Sarah's house in silence. Lucas's mind was a whirlwind of memories and fears. He had faced boardroom battles, cutthroat negotiations, and hostile takeovers, but none of it had prepared him for this moment. The house looked the same as before, humble, worn, but filled with a warmth that his luxurious properties lacked. As they stepped inside, Lucas heard the faint sound of a television in the living room. He followed Sarah down the hallway, feeling the tension grow with each step. Matthew was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. He looked up when he heard them enter, his expression hardening when he saw Lucas. "What's he doing here?" he asked sharply, his tone defensive. Sarah glanced at Lucas, then back at her son. "He's here to talk, Matthew," she said gently. "Just to talk." Matthew folded his arms, his jaw set stubbornly. "I don't want to talk to him." Lucas felt a pang of hurt, but kept his voice calm. "I know you're angry, Matthew," he said, taking a careful step forward. "And you have every right to be." The boy's eyes flashed with defiance. "You don't know anything about me." Lucas swallowed hard. "You're right," he admitted. "I don't know you as well as I should, but I want to change that." Matthew's gaze softened just a fraction, as if he wasn't entirely immune to the vulnerability in Lucas's voice. "Why now?" he asked, his voice filled with bitterness. "Why did it take you so long?" Lucas struggled to find the right words. "Because I was selfish," he said simply. "I thought I had to build an empire before I could have a family. But I was wrong." Matthew's expression remained conflicted. "You missed everything," he said, his voice cracking. "You weren't there for anything." "I know," Lucas said, his eyes filled with regret. "And I can't change that. But I can be here now, if you'll let me." For a moment, the boy seemed to waver, the walls around his heart weakening. But then he turned away, tears welling up in his eyes. "It's not that easy," he whispered. Lucas took a step closer, his voice low and sincere. "I'm not asking for it to be easy. I'm asking for a chance." The room fell silent, the only sound the rain pounding against the windows. Sarah watched, her heart breaking for both of them, unsure if this fragile connection would hold or shatter under the weight of the past. Finally, Matthew spoke, his voice barely audible. "I'll think about it." It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a start, an uncertain, fragile start, but a start nonetheless. And as Lucas stood there, watching his son for the first time with real understanding, he felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption here. The days that followed were filled with a tense uncertainty that Lucas wasn't accustomed to. He had spent years perfecting the art of negotiation and persuasion, but nothing prepared him for the slow, delicate process of earning his son's trust. There were no boardrooms here, no contracts to sign, just the daunting task of building a bridge over 10 years of absence. True to his word, Lucas began visiting more frequently, keeping his interactions simple and focused. He started by showing up at the soccer field, often staying back to watch Matthew's practices. Lucas kept his distance, not wanting to overwhelm Matthew, who still maintained a guarded demeanor. One afternoon, Lucas arrived at the field to find Matthew standing alone by the goalpost, the rest of the kids having left. He looked tired, kicking a ball idly against the net. Lucas hesitated, unsure if he was welcome, but then decided to approach anyway. "You're here early," Lucas said casually as he reached the boy. Matthew shrugged, not looking up. "Just needed some time to think." Lucas felt the familiar tug of sadness, wishing he had been there during all the other times Matthew had needed someone to talk to. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone light, trying not to sound desperate. Matthew paused, then gave a small nod. "If you want." Lucas picked up a stray ball from the ground, dribbling it slowly toward his son. "I used to play, you know," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I was pretty good at it, actually." Matthew shot him a skeptical look. "Yeah, right." Lucas grinned, sensing a tiny crack in Matthew's defenses. "It's true. I was the top scorer on my high school team. But that was a long time ago." Matthew seemed mildly interested, though his expression remained cautious. "Then show me what you got," he challenged, his voice carrying a hint of mischief. Lucas laughed, feeling a sense of relief that he hadn't experienced in years. "All right," he agreed, positioning the ball in front of him. "But don't blame me if I embarrass you in front of your friends next time." They started passing the ball back and forth, their movements slow and tentative at first. But gradually, the rhythm of the game took over, and they began to play with more energy. It was a simple moment, just a father and son kicking a ball under the afternoon sun. But to Lucas, it felt monumental. He watched as Matthew's face softened, a hint of a smile appearing, his guard slipping for the first time. "Nice shot," Lucas said, breathless, as Matthew managed to kick the ball past him into the net. Matthew's smile widened, a mix of pride and surprise. "Told you I was good," he said, his voice losing some of its previous hostility. Lucas nodded, catching his breath. "You definitely are." For a moment, there was a glimmer of something genuine between them, a fleeting connection that Lucas hoped could be the start of something real. But he also knew it wouldn't be that simple. Back at Sarah's house that evening, Lucas found himself in the kitchen with her, helping to prepare dinner. It was the first time he had stepped this far into her world since he had come back, and the familiarity of it was both comforting and painful. "Thanks for today," Sarah said quietly, handing him a bowl of salad to mix. "Matthew told me you guys played soccer together." Lucas's face lit up. "Yeah, it was nice. He's a good player." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's been hard for him. He's never really had a father figure." "I tried, but there are things a mother just can't fill." Lucas felt a pang of regret. "I know I can't make up for lost time," he said, his voice low, "but I want to try. I really do." Sarah sighed, her eyes filled with the weight of years of struggle. "I believe you, Lucas," she said after a moment, "but it's not just about trying. It's about being consistent. Matthew needs to know you're not going to disappear again." "I won't," Lucas promised, his voice firm. "Not this time." Dinner was a quiet affair, with Matthew sitting across from Lucas at the small table. The boy's demeanor was still guarded, but he seemed more relaxed than before. They ate in near silence, the only sounds being the clinking of cutlery and the soft hum of the fridge. It was awkward, but it was a start, a real, tangible start. As the night wore on, Sarah suggested that Lucas read one of Matthew's school assignments. It was a simple essay about heroes, a topic chosen by his teacher. Lucas felt a sense of dread as he scanned the pages, unsure of what he would find. Matthew's handwriting was neat, his words carefully chosen. The essay spoke about firefighters, doctors, and everyday people who helped others. But one line stood out, stopping Lucas in his tracks. Asterisk heroes are the ones who don't leave you when things get tough. Asterisk Lucas put the paper down, his throat tight with emotion. He looked up to find Matthew watching him closely, his eyes searching for a reaction. "That's a good essay," Lucas managed to say, his voice rough with unshed tears. Matthew nodded, his gaze unwavering. "It's true, though," he said softly. "Heroes don't leave." Lucas felt a deep sense of shame, but also a stronger determination. "I know," he whispered, "and I want to be that for you, Matthew. I want to be someone you can count on." The boy didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or at least the willingness to try. It was a small victory, but Lucas knew it was just the beginning of a long journey. The next morning, Lucas decided to take a more proactive step. He arrived at Matthew's school, wanting to meet his teachers and understand the environment his son was navigating. Sarah had mentioned that there had been some tension among the students, and Lucas wanted to see it for himself. The school was modest, with faded murals on the walls and children's laughter echoing through the halls. As he approached the main office, Lucas felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness, emotions that were foreign to him in his usual world of corporate boardrooms. He introduced himself to the principal, a stern woman named Mrs. Clark, who seemed surprised to see him there. "Mr. Donovan," she said, her tone professional but curious. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," Lucas replied, "but I wanted to talk about Matthew. I understand he's had some difficulties here, and I'd like to know how I can help." Mrs. Clark raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by his sudden involvement. "It's not common for parents in your position to come in like this," she said honestly, "but I appreciate it." Lucas felt a stab of guilt, knowing he was making up for lost time. "I'm here now," he said firmly, "and I want to do whatever I can to support him." As they talked, Lucas learned about the challenges Matthew faced: bullying, isolation, and the struggle to fit in as the son of a man he had never met. It was painful to hear, but it was necessary. "Matthew's a good kid," Mrs. Clark said, her voice softening, "but he needs stability. He needs to know someone's there for him." Lucas nodded, his resolve strengthening. He has that now, he promised. He has me. Later that evening, back at Sarah's house, Lucas found Matthew sitting at the kitchen table, working on his homework. Lucas sat down beside him, feeling the weight of the day's revelations. "How's it going?" he asked, his tone casual. Matthew shrugged. "Okay, I guess." Lucas hesitated, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small photo album he had brought with him. "I wanted to show you something," he said quietly, opening it to reveal old pictures from his youth. Matthew glanced at the album, his curiosity piqued. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing to a photo of a young Lucas playing soccer. "That's me," Lucas said, a hint of a smile in his voice. "Back when I still thought I could be a professional soccer player." Matthew's eyes widened. "Really?" Lucas nodded, feeling a rare warmth fill the room. "Yeah, but life had other plans, just like it does for everyone." For the first time, Matthew seemed genuinely interested. "What happened?" Lucas took a deep breath, knowing this was a moment of truth. "I made choices, Matthew. Some good, some bad. But I lost sight of what really mattered along the way. I don't want to lose that chance with you." Matthew didn't say anything, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A quiet understanding, perhaps, or at least the beginning of one. As they sat together, flipping through the pages of Lucas's past, there was a sense of possibility in the air. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start, a real, honest start. And for Lucas, that was more than he had dared to hope for. The days were getting colder, and a crisp wind blew through the trees, lining the quiet street where Sarah and Matthew lived. Lucas's visits had become more frequent, and, with each one, the guarded atmosphere seemed to thaw a little more. Yet, as the initial curiosity faded, the harder part began, facing the past and the secrets that had driven them apart. One evening, Sarah was sitting in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. The pictures were a mix of her younger years and Matthew's early childhood, memories captured in moments of happiness and struggle. Her fingers paused over a picture of her holding a newborn Matthew, her smile bright, but her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She couldn't help but think of everything Lucas had missed, the moments she had navigated alone. She heard the front door open and close softly. Lucas had arrived, as he did almost every evening now, carrying groceries or takeout from a nearby diner. Sarah looked up as he stepped into the living room, his eyes tired but filled with a quiet determination. "Hey," he greeted, noticing the album in her hands. "Hey," she replied, closing it quickly, as if caught in a private moment. "I was just looking through some old pictures." Lucas's gaze softened. "Mind if I see?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then handed him the album. He sat beside her on the worn couch, their shoulders almost touching. Lucas flipped through the pages slowly, his expression a mixture of wonder and regret. "Matthew was so small," he said, stopping at a photo of the boy as a toddler, his face smeared with chocolate ice cream. "He was," Sarah agreed, her voice quiet and stubborn even then. Lucas chuckled, though there was a sadness behind his smile. "I wish I could have been there for him. For you." Sarah didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on a photo of a younger Lucas tucked into the album, one she had saved from their time together years ago. It was a candid shot of him, laughing with abandon, his face free of the burdens he now carried. "You were a different man back then," she said softly. "Not perfect, but simpler." Lucas's eyes lingered on the photo. "I had dreams," he admitted, "but I was too focused on the future to realize what I was losing in the present." "Why did you really leave, Lucas?" Sarah's voice broke through the moment, the question heavy with years of unspoken pain. Lucas looked down, his hands tightening around the album. "I was scared," he confessed, his voice raw. "I wanted more than what we had, and I thought I needed to leave to get it. I convinced myself that it was worth the sacrifice." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You left me with nothing, Lucas. You left your own son with nothing." "I know," he said, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "And there's not a day that goes by that I don't regret it." Silence settled between them, thick with the memories of what could have been. It was a silence filled with blame, but also with the possibility of forgiveness. if either of them were brave enough to embrace it. Just then, Matthew appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice groggy. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes, trying to smile. "Just some old stories, honey." Matthew's gaze shifted between his parents, suspicion and curiosity battling within him. "Why are you both so sad?" Lucas felt his heart twist at the question. He didn't want Matthew to carry the burden of their past mistakes. "We're just remembering things," he said gently. "But we're also trying to make new memories now." Matthew seemed to consider this, then shrugged. "Can we order pizza tonight? I'm tired of spaghetti." The abrupt shift in conversation caught Lucas and Sarah off guard, but it also brought a sense of relief, a reminder that, despite everything, they were still a family trying to move forward. "Pizza it is," Lucas agreed, ruffling Matthew's hair playfully. As they sat down for dinner later, the mood was lighter. They laughed over Matthew's stories from school, and for a moment, it almost felt normal. Almost. But as the evening drew to a close, Lucas found himself alone with Sarah once again. The atmosphere grew serious, the weight of unresolved issues lingering like a storm that had yet to pass. "Sarah," Lucas began, his voice hesitant, "there's something I need to know." She looked at him warily, bracing herself. "What is it?" "Why didn't you tell me about Matthew sooner?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of pain and confusion. "Why did you keep him from me all these years?" Sarah's face hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you really want to know, Lucas?" "Because it's not a simple answer." "I need to know," he insisted, his gaze unwavering. "I need to understand why you thought it was better to raise him alone." Sarah exhaled slowly, the words coming out in a rush. "Because I didn't trust you," she admitted. "When you left, I didn't think you'd ever come back. I thought you had chosen a life without us, and I didn't want Matthew to grow up thinking he wasn't wanted." Lucas felt a surge of guilt and defensiveness. "But I didn't know, Sarah. I would have come back if I had known." "Would you?" she challenged, her voice rising. "Would you really have given up everything you built just to be a father?" The question cut deep, and Lucas knew there was no easy answer. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I would have tried." Sarah's eyes softened, the anger giving way to a deep sadness. "I know you want to make things right now," she said, her voice breaking. "But it's not just about wanting it, Lucas. It's about being there, day after day, even when it's hard." "I understand that now," he said quietly, "and I'm here for as long as it takes." As the tension slowly eased, there was a sense of reluctant hope in the room. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward it, a fragile, tentative step that could either grow stronger or crumble under the weight of the past. In the weeks that followed, Lucas's commitment became evident. He began attending parent-teacher meetings, cheering for Matthew at soccer games, and even helping with math homework. It was awkward at times, filled with moments of misunderstanding and frustration, but it was real, and that was all that mattered. One evening, as Lucas and Matthew were sitting in the backyard, staring up at the stars, Matthew broke the silence. "Do you think we can really be a family?" he asked, his voice tinged with vulnerability. Lucas felt a lump form in his throat. "I don't know what the future holds, Matthew," he said honestly, "but I know I want to try, with everything I have." Matthew nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I think I want to try too." It wasn't a declaration of love, nor was it a complete acceptance, but it was enough for Lucas, at least for now. As they sat there under the starlit sky, Lucas felt a small, fragile sense of peace, one that had eluded him for years. It was still uncertain, still filled with questions and challenges ahead, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Lucas dared to believe that redemption was possible. The first signs of winter began to appear, a biting chill in the air and the slow descent of leaves, now faded to deep browns and muted reds. The small suburban street where Sarah and Matthew lived felt quieter, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Lucas's presence had become a routine part of their lives now, but there was still an underlying tension, as though each day could either bring them closer or pull them apart. One evening, Lucas was at Sarah's house, sitting at the kitchen table while Sarah prepared dinner. Matthew was in his room, the door slightly ajar, with music playing softly in the background. Lucas glanced around the kitchen, noting the little signs of a life built in his absence. Matthew's school projects pinned to the fridge, a family calendar filled with scribbled reminders, and a jar of loose change labeled Disneyland Fund. "I've been meaning to ask," Lucas said, breaking the silence as he watched Sarah chop vegetables with practiced ease. "Have you ever thought about moving somewhere else? Maybe to a better neighborhood, closer to a better school?" Sarah paused, the knife stilling mid-cut. She looked at him with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Why do you ask?" Lucas shifted in his seat, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about Matthew's future. He deserves more opportunities, better resources." Sarah's expression was unreadable. "And you think moving would solve everything?" "No," Lucas admitted, "but it might help. I want to give him more than just apologies for the past. I want to give him a future." Sarah considered this, her gaze softening slightly. "It's not just about where we live, Lucas. It's about the people who stay." Lucas nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I know I've said it before, but I need you to believe it." "I'm trying," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the kitchen. The sound of footsteps interrupted their conversation, and Matthew appeared in the doorway. His hair was messy, and he wore a slight frown, as if he had been mulling over something serious. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, immediately concerned. Matthew hesitated, then looked directly at Lucas. "There's a parent-teacher night tomorrow," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Are you coming?" Lucas felt a rush of emotion, a mix of surprise and hope. It was the first time Matthew had openly invited him to something related to school. Of course, Lucas answered without hesitation. "I wouldn't miss it." The boy's frown relaxed slightly, though he still seemed uncertain. "Okay," he muttered before turning back toward his room. The next evening, Lucas arrived at the school with Sarah and Matthew. The building was bustling with parents, teachers, and students, all moving through the hallways in a sea of nervous energy. Lucas felt strangely out of place. He was used to commanding boardrooms, not school corridors filled with art projects and motivational posters. But this was where he needed to be. As they approached Matthew's classroom, Lucas noticed that the boy was quieter than usual. "Are you nervous?" he asked, trying to make light conversation. Matthew shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "A little, I guess." Lucas crouched slightly, lowering himself to Matthew's eye level. "You know, I used to get nervous too when my parents came to these things," he confessed, offering a small smile. "But no matter what, I'm proud of you." Matthew looked up, the surprise evident in his eyes. "Really?" "Really," Lucas confirmed, his voice filled with sincerity. Inside the classroom, parents and students found their seats, and the teacher, Mrs. Anderson, welcomed everyone with a warm smile. As she began discussing the students' progress, Lucas couldn't help but feel a pang of regret for missing out on these moments in the past. When it was Matthew's turn to present his recent project, Lucas's heart swelled with pride. The boy stood at the front of the class, holding a cardboard diorama of the solar system. His voice was steady, though there was a hint of nervousness. "This is my model of the planets," Matthew explained. "It's not perfect, but I worked hard on it." Lucas clapped loudly when Matthew finished, earning a shy smile from his son. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "He's never been this confident before." Lucas's chest tightened with emotion. It was a small victory, but one that felt monumental. He knew he was still far from earning full trust, but moments like these were a step in the right direction. After the meeting ended, Lucas noticed Matthew lingering near the classroom door, his gaze fixed on a group of boys who were laughing and chatting among themselves. Lucas recognized one of the boys as the same kid who had been taunting Matthew at soccer practice weeks earlier. "Is everything okay?" Lucas asked, approaching Matthew. The boy glanced up, his face a mix of frustration and sadness. "They're talking about a field trip next week," he said quietly, "but it costs a lot. Mom said we might not be able to afford it." Lucas felt a pang of helplessness. He knew Sarah was doing her best to manage expenses, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he should be doing more. "What if I helped?" he offered gently. Matthew hesitated, clearly torn. "I don't know. Mom doesn't like taking money from you." "It's not about money," Lucas assured him. It's about giving you experiences. I want to be a part of your life, not just someone who writes checks." Matthew considered this, his eyes searching Lucas's face for sincerity. "Okay," he said finally, "but you have to come with us on the field trip too." Lucas smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Deal." The following week, Lucas found himself on a bus full of noisy children heading toward the Natural History Museum. It was chaotic, with kids shouting, laughing, and jostling for seats, but Lucas didn't mind. He was sitting next to Matthew, who seemed more relaxed than usual. The museum was filled with wonders, dinosaur skeletons, ancient artifacts, and interactive exhibits that captivated the children. Lucas watched as Matthew's eyes lit up, his curiosity boundless. It was a side of his son he hadn't seen before, and it made him feel both grateful and guilty for the lost time. At one exhibit, Matthew turned to Lucas, his eyes wide with excitement. "Did you know that T-Rexes were one of the most powerful predators?" he asked, pointing to the massive skeleton towering above them. Lucas chuckled. "I do now," he said, trying to keep up with Matthew's enthusiastic explanations. As the day wore on, Lucas felt a growing sense of connection. It wasn't forced or awkward. It was natural, as if they were finally starting to find their rhythm. At one point, Matthew even reached out and grabbed Lucas's hand, pulling him toward another exhibit. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. By the time they returned to the school, Matthew was exhausted but happy. As they got off the bus, Sarah was waiting, her face filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "How was it?" she asked, looking between Lucas and Matthew. "It was awesome," Matthew exclaimed, his eyes shining. "Dad even helped me buy a T-Rex toy from the gift shop." Sarah's eyebrows shot up in surprise, her gaze shifting to Lucas. He simply shrugged, a sheepish smile on his face. "Couldn't resist," he said. Later that night, as Lucas prepared to leave, he found Matthew standing by the front door, looking thoughtful. "Dad," Matthew said hesitantly, the words still feeling new and tentative on his tongue. "Are you really going to stay?" Lucas's heart ached at the question, but he answered without hesitation. "Yes, Matthew," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Matthew nodded, a small, hopeful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good," he said simply. As Lucas drove back to his penthouse that night, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with potential setbacks and unspoken truths. But for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction, toward a future that was no longer defined by regret, but by the promise of redemption. And in that moment, Lucas knew that no matter what came next, he would face it as a father, not as a man trying to make amends from a distance. The December air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Christmas lights twinkled on almost every house in the neighborhood, creating a festive glow that softened the long winter nights. For the first time in years, Lucas felt an unexpected warmth as he drove down the familiar street towards Sarah's house. The holiday season, once just a blur of business meetings and corporate parties, now held a different meaning, one that involved a small, but growing, family. Inside the modest living room, the atmosphere was both chaotic and cozy. Boxes of Christmas decorations lay scattered across the floor, and a half-decorated tree stood proudly in one corner. Matthew was busy untangling a string of colorful lights, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Need some help?" Lucas asked as he stepped inside, shaking the cold from his coat. Matthew looked up, a grin breaking across his face. "Yeah, these lights are messed up," he said, handing Lucas the tangled mess. Lucas crouched beside him, carefully working through the knots. "You know," he said with a smile, "I used to do this with my mom when I was your age. She'd always let me put the star on top of the tree." Matthew paused, considering this piece of information. "Really? I thought you grew up in some fancy mansion." Lucas laughed, shaking his head. "No, not at all. My family wasn't rich. We had to save up just to buy a tree some years." Matthew seemed surprised, as if the idea of a younger, less successful version of Lucas was difficult to imagine. "Did you ever wish for anything special for Christmas?" he asked, his voice curious. Lucas thought for a moment, then nodded. "I always wished for a train set. One year, My mom made it happen. It wasn't the biggest or the best, but it was mine. Matthew's eyes widened. Do you still have it? No, Lucas admitted, a hint of regret in his voice. It got lost somewhere along the way. But it was the thought that mattered. Matthew's gaze lingered on Lucas, as if seeing him in a different light. Maybe we can get a new one, he suggested. Lucas felt a lump form in his throat. I'd like that, he said, his voice softer than before. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Dinner's almost ready, she announced, her eyes softening at the sight of Lucas and Matthew sitting side by side on the floor. Need any help? Lucas offered, standing up. Sure, Sarah replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. You can set the table. As they moved around the kitchen, setting plates and silverware, there was an unspoken ease between them, a familiarity that had been absent for so long. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something new, something tentative but promising. Dinner was a simple affair, with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a small salad. They ate together, sharing stories and laughter that felt almost natural. Lucas noticed that Matthew seemed more animated, more open, as if the barriers between them were slowly crumbling. But as the evening wore on, Lucas sensed a shift in Sarah's demeanor. There was a quiet tension in her eyes, something she was holding back. He watched her carefully, waiting for the right moment to ask. After Matthew had gone to bed, Lucas found Sarah sitting alone in the living room, staring at the glowing tree. He approached cautiously, unsure of what was weighing on her mind. You okay? He asked gently, taking a seat beside her. Sarah sighed, her gaze still fixed on the tree. I've been thinking a lot, she admitted, her voice low. About you, about us, about everything. Lucas felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. What's on your mind? He asked, trying to keep his tone steady. She hesitated, then turned to face him. I know you've been trying, Lucas, and I see the changes. But there's something I haven't told you, something that's been weighing on me for years. Lucas's heart raced, unsure of what she was about to reveal. What is it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked away, her eyes filled with pain. When you left, it wasn't just that I was alone. I was scared. I was struggling, financially and emotionally. And there were moments when I didn't know if I'd make it through. Lucas felt a deep, crushing guilt wash over him. Sarah, I'm so sorry, he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. There's more, she said, her voice breaking. There were people who tried to help, people who wanted to be a part of Matthew's life. But I pushed them away because I always hoped that one day you'd come back. Lucas was stunned, his mind reeling. He hadn't expected this kind of confession, hadn't realized the depth of Sarah's loneliness and the choices she had made because of him. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked, his voice filled with raw emotion. Sarah's eyes were filled with tears now. Because I didn't want to make you feel worse than you already do. I wanted to protect you from the full extent of what your absence did to us. Lucas felt an overwhelming urge to hold her, to offer some kind of comfort. But he knew that this moment wasn't about him. It was about acknowledging the pain he had caused, without excuses. I can't change the past, Sarah, he said quietly, but I can be here now. I want to be here now, for both of you. Sarah wiped her eyes, her expression a mix of exhaustion and a fragile hope. I want to believe that, Lucas. I really do. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the soft crackling of the fireplace. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start, a real, honest attempt to face the past and build something new. The next morning, Lucas found Matthew in the living room, his eyes wide with excitement. Look what I found, the boy exclaimed, holding up a brochure for a Christmas train ride in a nearby town. Lucas took the brochure, a smile spreading across his face. You really want to go? He asked. Matthew nodded eagerly. Yeah, it's supposed to be really cool, with hot chocolate and everything. Lucas felt a surge of joy, a sense that perhaps they were finally moving towards something real. Then let's do it, he said. Let's make it a Christmas to remember. The day of the train ride was clear and cold, with a light dusting of snow covering the ground. Lucas, Sarah, and Matthew boarded the vintage train. their breath visible in the chilly air. Inside, the train was warm and festive, filled with twinkling lights, carols playing softly, and the smell of freshly baked cookies. Matthew's eyes were wide with wonder as he looked out the window, watching the snowy landscape roll by. Lucas watched him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for this moment, one he had once thought impossible. "Thank you for this," Sarah said quietly, sitting beside Lucas. "It's more than I could have hoped for." Lucas's eyes were filled with sincerity as he replied, "It's just the beginning, Sarah." She nodded, a small, hopeful smile on her lips. "I know." And as the train chugged along through the snowy countryside, Lucas felt a sense of peace settle over him. A peace that came not from the success he had built, but from the family he was finally learning to cherish. The weeks following the Christmas train ride were filled with a mix of everyday moments that slowly began to form a sense of stability in Lucas's new reality. Winter was at its peak now, and the neighborhood was blanketed in snow, transforming the streets into a quiet, peaceful scene. Inside Sarah's small house, the feeling was warmer than ever, as if the laughter and closeness were finally settling into something more lasting. Lucas had become a regular fixture, not just an occasional visitor. He helped with morning routines, attended parent-teacher conferences, and even began cooking breakfast on weekends, though his skills left something to be desired. The moments he spent with Matthew were no longer strained or tentative. Instead, they were filled with the natural flow of a father and son discovering one another, building Lego sets, working on homework, and watching movies on Friday nights. But there was still one thing Lucas needed to do, something that weighed on him with increasing urgency. One snowy Saturday morning, Lucas and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee. Matthew was outside, bundled up in a coat, playing in the yard. Lucas watched him for a moment, a mix of pride and longing on his face. "Sarah," he began slowly, his voice serious, "there's something I need to talk to you about." She looked up, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What is it?" Lucas took a deep breath, feeling the words gather in his chest. "I want to make this official," he said. "I want to be legally recognized as Matthew's father." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, her face reflecting a mix of surprise and concern. "Are you sure, Lucas? This is a big step." "I know," he said, his gaze steady, "but it's the right step. I want Matthew to know that I'm here for good, in every way that matters." Sarah seemed to weigh his words carefully. "It's not going to be easy," she warned. "There are legal processes, and Matthew might have questions we're not ready to answer." Lucas nodded, understanding the complexities. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm ready for it." Sarah's expression softened, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I believe you, Lucas. I really do." The following week, Lucas contacted a family lawyer, determined to navigate the necessary legal steps to establish paternity. It was a daunting process, filled with paperwork and meetings, but Lucas approached it with the same determination he had once reserved for his business ventures. This time, though, his motivation was driven by something far more personal, a desire to protect the bond he had begun to build with his son. Meanwhile, Lucas's relationship with Matthew continued to deepen, though it wasn't without challenges. One evening, Matthew sat at the kitchen table, struggling with a difficult math problem. Lucas was beside him, trying to offer guidance. "Just take it one step at a time," Lucas suggested, his voice patient. Matthew's frustration boiled over. "I don't get it," he exclaimed, slamming his pencil down. Lucas felt a familiar pang of helplessness, but he kept his voice calm. "It's okay not to understand right away. We can try again." Matthew's eyes flashed with anger and confusion. "Why are you trying so hard?" he asked, his voice filled with both accusation and vulnerability. "You weren't here before. Why do you care so much now?" The question hung in the air, raw and heavy. Lucas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I made a mistake," he admitted. "I wasn't here when you needed me, and I can't change that. But I can be here now, and I want to be." Matthew's eyes softened, though the hurt remained. "It's just hard to trust that," he said quietly. Lucas reached out, placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder. "I know, and that's okay. You don't have to trust me all at once. But I'll keep showing up, every day." The boy nodded slowly, his expression a mix of uncertainty and hope. I guess that's all I really want. The legal process dragged on for several months, filled with unexpected delays and complications. But Lucas persisted, never wavering in his commitment. He attended every meeting, signed every form, and answered every question honestly. Throughout it all, Sarah remained a steady presence, supporting him even when doubts crept in. Finally, the day came when the court recognized Lucas's paternity. It was a simple ceremony, held in a small courtroom with only a few people present. As the judge finalized the decision, Lucas felt a rush of emotions, relief, joy, and a profound sense of responsibility. He looked over at Sarah, who was holding Matthew's hand. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Congratulations," she whispered to Lucas as they left the courtroom. "Thank you," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "For everything." Outside the courthouse, Matthew seemed unusually quiet. Lucas knelt down to meet his eyes. "Are you okay, buddy?" he asked gently. Matthew nodded, though there was a seriousness in his expression that belied his age. "Does this mean you're my real dad now?" he asked. Lucas felt a surge of love, so strong it almost overwhelmed him. "Yes," he said, his voice firm but tender. "But I've always been your dad, and here," he added, placing a hand over his heart. Matthew's eyes welled up with tears, and he threw his arms around Lucas in an unexpected, fierce hug. "I love you, Dad," he whispered. Lucas's own tears flowed freely as he held his son close. "I love you too, Matthew," he said, his voice breaking. "More than you'll ever know." The following weeks were filled with a newfound sense of stability. The legal recognition seemed to have lifted a burden from Matthew's small shoulders, and he began to blossom in ways Lucas had only hoped for. His grades improved, his friendships deepened, and his laughter became more frequent and uninhibited. One evening, as they all sat in the living room watching a movie, Matthew suddenly spoke up. "Can we go to Disneyland this summer?" he asked, his eyes bright with excitement. Sarah chuckled, but Lucas looked thoughtful. "Why not?" he said. "We've been saving for it, haven't we?" Matthew's face lit up with a smile that was both innocent and filled with hope. "Really? You mean it?" "I do," Lucas assured him. "It's about time we made some new memories." As the months passed, Lucas found himself becoming more at home in Sarah's small house than in his own luxurious penthouse. He still maintained his business empire, but it no longer defined him. The cold, corporate boardrooms were replaced by warm, chaotic dinners, soccer games, and even school plays where Matthew would nervously search the audience for his father's reassuring presence. One night, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Sarah turned to Lucas, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know," she said softly, "I never thought we'd get here." Lucas paused, drying a plate. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I'm glad we did." Sarah's eyes held a quiet vulnerability. "Me too." There was no need for more words. In that moment, they understood each other completely, two people who had once been broken but had found a way to rebuild, not just for themselves, but for their son. On a warm summer day, as the family packed for their long-awaited Disneyland trip, Lucas took a moment to reflect. He stood in the doorway, watching Sarah help Matthew with his suitcase. It was a scene of ordinary life, filled with laughter and playful bickering over what to pack. But to Lucas, it was extraordinary. It was a life he had never imagined but had always needed. A life built on second chances, honest apologies, and the slow, steady growth of trust and love. And as he joined his family, Lucas felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He was no longer defined by his past mistakes, but by the love he had found in the present. For the first time in years, he was home,